Hello and welcome back to the second episode of Japan Memo this year. Japan Memo is, of course, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. In this series, we bring together experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today, we're extremely pleased to welcome two more wonderful guests to the show, Dr Kristin Vekasi and Professor Hatakeyama Kyoko, to discuss the recent evolving dynamics of Japan's critical mineral strategy. Both Kristin and Kyoko have generously given their time to the IISS Japan Chair previously. Kristin was a guest in a webinar on critical materials and green energy in the Indo-Pacific in April last year, and Kyoko appeared on a Japan Memo podcast in October 2024 to talk about the security and foreign policy of the Ishiba administration. So welcome back, both of you. Before we dive into the discussion, let me briefly introduce our two wonderful guests. Dr. Kristin Vekasi is Mansfield Chair of Japan and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the University of Montana. She specializes in Northeast Asia and the political economy of critical mineral and technologies, supply chains, focusing on trade and investment strategies for states and businesses in changing geopolitical environments. Kristin is the author of a book published in 2020 by Routledge that actually I think looks increasingly prescient. Its title is Risk Management and Strategies of Japanese Companies in Asia, Political Crisis and Multinational Firms. Welcome back, Kristin.
Thank you so much.
Professor Hatakeyama Kyoko is Professor of International Relations at the Graduate School of International Studies and Regional Development at the University of Niigata Prefecture in Japan. Her research interests include Japan's foreign and security policy, international relations in Asia, maritime affairs and economic security, and she's published widely. One of her most recent publications is The Trajectory of Japan's Peacekeeping Policy During the Cold War from the Journal of Cold War Studies in 2025. I was also fortunate enough to be able to present alongside Kyoko Sensei at a Nakasone Peace Institute event in Tokyo last year. So welcome back, Kyoko.
Thank you very much.
First section of the podcast, let's take a look at, if we're thinking about rare earths, we have to think about the Japan-China relationship, particularly recently. But any discussion of the weaponization of rare earths as a tool of economic statecraft tends to start with China's temporary curb on exports of certain rare earths to Japan in 2010 on the back of an escalation of tensions over the Senkaku Islands, which Japan controls, but which China claims. Since then, Japan has worked hard to boost its rare earth supply chain resilience, partly by building critical mineral stockpiles, but also there's other policies as well. Prime Minister Takaichi Sanai's administration in Japan also looks like it will further consolidate Japanese critical mineral strategy as a matter of policy priority in the coming years. So first question to Kristin and Kyoko, how do you assess Japan's critical mineral strategy over the past 15 years or so? Kristin, if we could start with you, please.
Yes, absolutely. I started working on rare earths specifically, and now we talk about critical minerals more broadly in about 2009. And the reason I did this is I was in China studying with an economist there, and I was working on sort of Japan-China business relations. And before I left China that time, she's like, Kristin, or Kylie, my Chinese name, Kylie, what you really need to focus on is you need to look at rare earths. This is going to be very interesting, and I think this will help you with your research. I was like, okay, I will find out what these things are. I don't know. And so I started doing research. And then in the next fall in 2010, I was in Japan doing a field work, and this event happens at the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. And rare earths suddenly become a geopolitical issue. And I was very fortunately placed at the time, but intellectually as well as geographically, it's very interesting that because when we assess Japan's response to this crisis in 2010, it should be done in the context of this was a problem that people knew about prior to the crisis. And it was only because there was a sense of crisis at the time that I argue Japan really responded at all. And I think that helps us understand, and I'll talk about Japan's trajectory or assess Japan's trajectory in a second, but more broadly, when we think about what is happening today with rare earths and how countries are responding in very recent times, we can think about how Japan responded in 2010 and maybe get some roadmaps and some paths from that experience. Japan, more than maybe any other country, but certainly most other countries that are in similar kinds of supply chain difficulties regarding rare earths has responded effectively. We can see that in a number of this three-pronged project, some of it even from 2009, but largely from 2010, 2011, of diversification, research into recycling, as well as research into substitution. And so, right, figuring can we use less? Can we reuse? Can we use something else? Or can we find different sources? And we've seen some success in all three of those, particularly thinking about diversification. Japan went from almost 100%, over 90% dependence on China for rare earth imports down to about, I mean, the numbers change, but 50 to 60%. And it has gone back up in recent years as demand for rare earths has also gone back up. But Japan did effectively develop a non-Chinese supply chain, first for light rare earths via Australia and Malaysia, and now also very minimally also for heavy rare earths, which are really important in a lot of these green technologies. That hasn't happened with other minerals. Other countries also haven't had as much success. So I think Japan does stand out as a country that has responded effectively to this initial crisis.
2010, was that a real watershed year, do you think, in terms of how Japan calibrates policy? To re-slice the question, do you think that Japan would have done similar things in terms of, you mentioned the 3 points: diversification, recycling, substitution. Would it have done similar things had they not had that 2010 crisis?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we look at this comparatively, lots of other countries saw what happened in 2010 and said, oh no, we need to respond. And there's all this flurry of activity and there's all these projects that start. And in the United States, there's congressional hearings and there's bills that are drafted and all of these things, and they all fizzle out. In Japan, they don't fizzle out. I think that Japan's may have fizzled out as well, if not given this sense of urgency on the part of the government. But even more so, I think that there was an urgency and concern on the part of the private sector that made key private sector firms more willing to work with the government in order to expand these supply chains. Less efficient, more expensive countries, and it introduced, all sorts of new risks and new challenges and environmental issues, all of these problems that are the reason that the supply chain is concentrated in the first place didn't disappear. The other problems became more acute. So firms were willing to cooperate. So I do think it was a watershed moment because of both that change in mindset as well as the business state cooperation.
Kyoko, Kristin's got a fairly positive evaluation of Japan's critical minerals strategy over the last 15 years. Do you think she's right?
Yes, I agree. So let me explain Japan's strategy from longer perspective. I would say that Japan's strategy should be understood as a part of much longer pattern in Japan's policy. Japan has been highly sensitive to the procurement of natural resources because it lacks sufficient domestic resources of its own. So oil is a classic example. For decades, Japan has paid close attention to the stable supply of strategically important resources, so mainly oil. From that perspective, Japan's approach to critical minerals is not entirely new. What we see today is, in many ways, an extension of an older strategy, maintaining good relations with suppliers, diversifying suppliers, and recycling and stockpiling to reduce vulnerability. So in that sense, Japan's strategy has been quiet, but quite active, even if it has not always attracted global attention. 2010 rare earth shock, of course, was an important turning point, as Robert said, because it made these vulnerabilities much more visible and push Japan to strengthen its effort in a more focused way. But the basic logic was already there. Japan did not suddenly discover supply chain risk in 2010. Rather, it strengthened an existing concern under new geopolitical conditions. So I would say that the Economic Security Promotion Act, which was adopted in 2022, is significant, but not because it created an entirely new strategy from scratch. It's important because the Japanese government has made its commitment much more explicit and institutionalized. In other words, the act is remarkable because it shows a stronger political willingness to invest state capacity and policy attention in securing critical supplies. So overall, I would say Japan's critical mineral strategy as evolutionary rather than revolutionary. So the core strategy, which is stable procurement, diversification, recycling, and stockpiling, have been consistent for a long time. So what has changed is the level of urgency and the geopolitical context. So these efforts are now emphasized under a term economic security.
Kyoko, you're emphasizing the continuity of
Exactly.
Japanese policy. You're both broadly think that Japan's done a pretty good job, I think, since 2010, obviously, with your point, Kyoko, about the evolutionary nature of what's happened up to then. If you're marking Japan's score sheet, where do you think Japan needed to do more between 2010 and now, do you think? Japan operates in a very complicated external environment, lots of challenges, domestic, foreign, and so on, that complicate policy implementation. Where do you think Japan needed to do more? Kristin?
And this is classic academic. Oh, this is this great story, and here's the success. But on the other hand, let's talk about all of the things that didn't work. We always tell this Australia-Malaysia story. It's a very impressive story in many ways. It more or less worked out and continues to develop. There's a lot of survivorship bias here because Japan also had projects attempted to diversify the rare earth supply chain in Vietnam, India, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Uzbekistan, Canada, the United States, and other places as well. And those have not yet, at least, worked out in terms of actually providing an alternative. That's very, very common in mining. It's a high risk, very long time horizon industry. To expect everything that is initiated to work out is an unreasonable expectation. There's been a lot of dead ends. This overseas work has been facilitated through the organization JOGMEC in Japan. And that organization has given out grants or loans or financing facilitation instruments. And the utilization rate of those is also quite low. Firms get the project and then they go and they do their initial due diligence. It's like, okay, this is not a good path to take. And then they back out. And that's probably a good business decision. Is it a good economic security decision? Well, honestly, maybe so, because there are scarce resources. There's a lot of different pieces in this diversification and supply chain resilience puzzle. So to really just focus on the one project in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan that might take a very long time and might not provide this kind of supply chain that Japan is looking for might not be a good idea. Just focusing on the success implies that that's all Japan did, which of course is not true. There's lots of things that didn't work out.
A nice segue to you, Kyoko. What do you think Japan could have done differently, perhaps, or dealt differently with the challenges?
So it's very difficult to answer this question, isn't it? Kristin already pointed out Japan started to invest Australia, Linus, Malaysia, and other countries, and they started to explore other possibilities to secure rare earth minerals. But the problem is due to the environmental cost and also economic cost, it was very difficult for Japan to invest a lot in other countries and cut the tie with China. In terms of economic viability, Japan didn't have to do so much. Japan should have made a bit of efforts to diversify the suppliers. If somebody asked me, oh, Japan should have done more, I would have said maybe no, because in terms of economic cost or economic viability, it was not a realistic option, I think. Yeah. And if it's maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, some academics might have said that, okay, we would see a very harsh China-US competition. But it was difficult for most of the countries or for most of the people to expect that we see a very harsh US-China competition, even in economic area.
So let's fast forward from 2010 to 2026, and Japan finds itself in a similar predicament. But obviously, the relations with China, the balance of power between Japan and China has shifted quite significantly in China's favor, I would argue. Kristin, you mentioned earlier about a compare and contrast between 2010 and now, so I'd be quite interested to get your thoughts on that. As a bit of background, in January this year, following on from Prime Minister Takaichi's remarks in Japan's parliament in November 2025 about a Taiwan contingency potentially constituting a survival threatening situation for Japan, Beijing again curbed exports of some rare earths as part of a broader curb on exports to Japan of dual use materials. And in February this year, China further escalated by barring dual use exports to 20, I think, named Japanese companies, as well as putting another 20 on the watch list subject to further licensing. So you've got all this from China with rare earths and dual use exports. But in February 2026, Tokyo successfully retrieved rare earth elements from the seafloor at an astonishing depth of 6,000 meters below the surface around Minami Torishima Island, which is in the North Pacific to the northeast of Guam. So quite a lot going on from China again, but also Japan making this amazing find. Kristin, what do these deep sea rare earths mean for Japan, given the escalating geo-economic tensions between Japan and China, do you think?
The Minami Torishima rare earths, I think, are such a great encapsulation of the rare earth geopolitical responses more generally, because this project is actually a response to the 2010 crisis. It started in 2011 is when the initial exploration, there was funding. It was one of these sort of pie in the sky kinds of solutions to rare earth supply chain choke point. Here we are, 15 years later, saying, oh, look, it's going to solve the current crisis. Well, I thought it was solving the last crisis. Maybe it's the same crisis. Even then, right, so the time horizon's 15 years. It's very long. I'd say we're at mid-stage of this project. Could it potentially be a game changer? Well, maybe. It's still very small scale. It's still largely academic. It's really neat. Like it's so deep and it's very intriguing. In some ways, I think it's cinematic, right? So deep down and this mud is coming up and what is in it, etc. In many ways, I think we should focus on more practical solutions, things that maybe have a time horizon of 3 years or 5 years rather than looking out a lot further. People also talk about mining asteroids and the moon. And in some ways, I think that reflects our focus on these very distant kinds of places rather than maybe the more mundane solutions. Could they enhance the strategy? Maybe. That's still a long-term solution, is how I interpret it. I think we can look at this, though, as long-term commitment from the Japanese economic security institutions, that this is so far out in the future, and the financial and political commitment has stayed with the project. That's really, I think, an indication of what Kyoko was saying earlier, that this is part of this broader approach and strategy and commitment to Japan's raw material, natural resource, fundamental insecurities and scarcities.
Kyoko, I could see you nodding. Do come in, please.
I totally agree to what Kristin said. I want to add a few points. We know that there are lots of rare earths around Minami Torishima, and we got it this year. However, I don't think that was a practical solution because, as Kristin said, it's a very long-term story, so we may not be able to turn the mud into an actual use, but we may not be able to. So rather than it's a practical solution, it's a kind of signal or message to the world or to China that we have lots of rare earth mud in the sea. And if you do not provide rare earth at all, we would be able to secure rare earth. So we have the capacity to do that. And also, it's a kind of message to the public that, okay, we don't have to worry about the Chinese coercion and we don't have to worry about rare earths because we have the rare earths in our EEZ. So after we got the rare earth mud in Minami Torishima, Prime Minister Takaichi said, oh, we don't have to worry about rare earths anymore. It's wrong. we still have to worry about rare earths. So it's a kind of message or signal that we don't have to worry about the Chinese economic coercion, and we could do that. And of course, we may be able to use the rare earths in Minami Torishima effectively. And in terms of economic viability, it may be possible if we could develop a new technology.
I think you're agreed that it's a politically important, strategically important message at the moment from Minami Torishima rather than being a sort of practical solution. Kristin, you wanted to come in.
I don't necessarily think it's a smart political move to say it's okay, we have these rare earths, because it removes that
Yeah.
sense of urgency. Yeah. Willingness to use public funds to have this. If there's a commitment to having non-Chinese supply chains, then there's a reason they're in China, and that reason has to do with cost largely. And so you have to commit these funds and you have to think in the long term. And if you, it's like, well, why aren't we just doing the deep sea ones? Then, I mean, I think the political calculus changes in a way that's maybe not helpful, short, medium term. One of the things that's interesting is it's tempting to look for sort of technical solutions to this problem. And I think the deep sea mining, the lunar mining is also one of these, but we do have some more technical solutions that are on the table that I think are worth pursuing more vigorously, and particularly looking at mining waste and extracting critical materials from mining waste. There often are economically viable concentrations of rare earths, of other things that are on these lists that are typically mining byproducts, things like gallium and germanium, and that also are really focused and concentrated in China. And Japan as well, right, has a history of mining and has slag and has environmental destruction from that. And focusing our basic research, our scientific energies on solving two problems at once, extracting these scarcer vitamin-style minerals from that slag and also cleaning up our prior messes from industrialization, is a place I think that we could do a lot more work. That's something that's also happening right here in Montana. It's not easy to do that. This is one of my favorite metaphors. Like, you have bread dough and you have to get the salt out of your bread dough. Like, how do you do that, right? It's not like you can just like pipette it out or something. This is also a very difficult process, but that's a process where I think it's worth a long-term investment. It might be quicker, but it also I think might be more practical even than going under the ocean.
Your point about the technical solutions, I think Kyoko made the same point a bit earlier, but I liked your idea of the Minami Torishima extraction being cinematic. That's a nice way to put it, but obviously mining waste extraction rather less cinematic
Yes.
sort of grabs fewer headlines for the politicians. Moving on, Kyoko, you wrote a chapter, excellent chapter, highly recommended to our listeners actually, called The Political Economy of Rare Earth Elements, published in Palgrave Macmillan 2015. You say that Japan maintains its supply chains for rare earths, but that its rare earth capacity is limited in comparison with that of China. Do you think that Japan should try to build its capacity for rare earths to boost resilience for its rare earth supply chain with China? Or is, given the sort of the asymmetry of scale and China's leading position here, is this unrealistic for Japan?
Some Japanese companies, such as Shin-Etsu Chemicals, have its own supply chain, except mining. However, their production capacities are quite limited. So I would say that Japan should definitely strengthen its rare earth supply chain, but trying to match China in scale is unrealistic. China's strength is not just its mines. It also has enormous capacity in separation, refining, and processing. Those parts of supply chain are very difficult to replicate quickly and also cheaply because it damages the environment enormously. Japan cannot follow the same path as China. It's unrealistic. I don't think that goal of Japan should be to compete with China in volume. A more realistic approach for Japan is to build capacity in recycling, stockpiling, high value magnet production, or diversification. So, in other words, Japan does not need self sufficiency. What it needs is greater resilience. the priority should be to reduce vulnerability to supply disruptions. This is what already Kristin explained, but in 2011, Japan moved to reduce its dependence on Chinese rare earths by backing Australia's Lynas rare earths through a joint package led by Sojitz and Jogmec. That is very successful. New agreement, that is 2023 agreement, states that up to 65% of the heavy rare earths produced by Lynas would be supplied to Japanese market. It's sort of successful in diversifying suppliers and also to secure procurement. I don't think that full-scale competition with China would be possible, but building a more secure and reliable supply chain could be possible and realistic and also necessary.
Your point about self-sufficiency not being resilience is a good one, I think, and an important one, because I think in economic security discussions, the conversation tends to default towards we need to be self-sufficient in everything, but that's not the same as resilience, is what you're saying, I think. An important point. Moving on to the future cooperation now, one of the things that struck me from late last year was the agreement between Japan and the US, the framework agreement to secure the supply of critical minerals and rare earths. This is part of what seemed to be a campaign by the US to strike these agreements with key countries. In February this year, the US government launched a new initiative for strategic stockpiles of critical minerals for economic security called Project Vault. Coming back to the US, with the Prime Minister Takaichi due to meet President Trump later this month in the US, those of us sort of watching this will be looking sort of eagle-eyed for what is said on critical minerals between Takaichi and Trump. But Kristin, what do you think we can expect for the US-Japan relationship in terms of future critical mineral strategy?
Perhaps one area where the Trump administration is a little bit more predictable than other areas. So I do actually see a lot of continuity in what the Trump administration has been doing with respect to international cooperation in critical minerals that we saw from Obama, Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2. And with Japan, particularly, Japan, United States started international cooperation on critical minerals right away. They had the first meeting in 2011 to try and think about diversification and resilience and all of these things. Right? Our words have changed over the years, but since then there have been many overlapping initiatives between Japan and the U.S., including a lot of U.S.-Japan discussions and forums and agreements, things with the Quad, the Mineral Security Partnership under Biden that's still kind of around. There was a lot of critical minerals in Biden's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. U.S.-Japan Critical Minerals Agreement was connected to Biden's Inflation Reduction Act about green technology, specifically electric vehicles. Under the current Trump administration, there's sort of a similar kind of thinking. And that thinking is that critical minerals are a structural supply chain risk and that they're central to economic security and that you can't go it alone. Like there is a need because of the geography of this to do it. Biden tended to do it more in trade law with frameworks and multilateral, plurilateral cooperation. The Trump administration is embedding it more in security tools, in sort of market engineering, in direct state intervention, and a little bit more than the Biden administration. And of course, he's much more bilateral. That's his preferred diplomatic approach. It's a little bit hard to say exactly what this is going to look like. It will probably involve specific, right, firm-to-firm investments. I can imagine the investment agreement or discussions that were part of bringing the tariff levels lower, the deal that was made last fall. There have already been some initial announcements of investments, and I can imagine that in Takaichi's visit, there'll be more announcements of Japanese private sector and maybe public-private sector investment opportunities in the United States that will be somehow related to maybe things downstream. So magnets, perhaps, things related to critical mineral and rare earth supply chain. So those are the sort of the things that I'm looking for. And again, timelines, time horizons here are very long. Announcements are not the same as implementation. So we'll need to have this conversation in 5 or 6 years and assess how it actually played out.
I'm looking forward to having this conversation in 15 years when the Minami Torishima thing has finally reached its fruition. So you book yourselves in 15 years from now, we do another podcast. So you're looking, Kristin, for deeper engagement between Japan and the US in critical minerals, and this will partly be driven by Japanese investment inside the US.
Yes, I think
What you're
so.
saying?
And
Yeah.
this will not be a dramatic change from many of the conversations
Mm.
that have happened before. There's certainly less of a focus on environment and sustainability and good governance in the Trump administration frameworks, but I did some systematic analysis of these different frameworks and the agreements that were written. There are a lot of striking similarities, and it's really about the ESG components where there's differences as well as multilateral versus bilateral. Those are all really important things, but we do also see continuity. I think this is where we might see more continuity than change.
Kyoko, Japan's critical mineral strategy has been gaining more international attention, particularly in Europe. Various countries looking at what Japan's doing and in terms of trying to calibrate their own economic security strategy for rare earths and so on. One example is the EU's new action plan for critical raw materials strategy, Resource EU Action Plan, it's called, which proposes to establish a European critical raw materials centre, so emulating Japan's Organization for Metals and Energy Security, or JOGMEC, as we've been talking about earlier, which is an institution that works to secure stable supplies of critical minerals and other resources to Japan. So, Kyoko, against this backdrop, what more do you think Japan needs to do to enhance its resource and economic security diplomacy with global partners apart from the US, in addition to the US?
Japan could play a role as a model for other countries because Japan has long experience in dealing with resource vulnerability. It has developed practical strategies such as diversification, stockpiling, recycling, and state-backed resource diplomacy. That experience gives Japan credibility, and it means Japan can contribute as a role model and also a reliable partner. By using these strengths, Japan may be able to take initiatives in strengthening supply chain with other countries. At the same time, I think we need to develop a new technology to avoid overdependence on rare earth materials. I would like to add one thing. We are now very concerned about rare earths, and we try to reduce dependence on Chinese rare earths. And so that's why we try to cooperate with each other and invest more. And that is the right direction because we need strong and reliable supply chain. However, China needs to sell their rare earths. The price of rare earths goes ups and downs considerably. And China already invested a lot. So I think China also needs to export the same as oil. The Middle Eastern countries needs to export oil. In 1973, they actually used oil as a kind of economic weapon, but at the same time, they need to sell oil. So it's the same as China. China needs to sell rare earths, even though China sometimes use rare earth material as a source of tool to impose economic sanctions. Definitely, we need to reduce overdependence and we need to diversify the supply chain. We need to reduce the amount of rare earth usage. However, I don't think we have to worry overly. Maybe we could establish a stable and good relationship with China. And that is also one of the solutions to supply chain risk.
Nice to end the content discussion on a high note, trying to work with China. But the other thing I think that's come through our discussions has been the need to develop new technologies to get away from rare earth. And I think Japan must be in a good position to do that, given its long years of experience of resource scarcity and so on. So this brings us to our Japan memo questions, which we ask all our fabulous guests. We've had some wonderful answers, which we pull together in the end of the year into a long list of everything everyone's recommended so that there's a wonderful resource for people who are looking to learn a bit more about Japan. And Kyoko, this is obviously your second time round for these questions. The two questions are, if you have any book recommendations for listeners who want to understand Japan or understand Japan better. And the second question is what you think people often get wrong about Japan. So, Kristin, over to you.
There's so many wonderful books out there about Japan. And I decided to take this as as a political scientist. And I chose two books that I think are really excellent for looking at the bread and butter of Japanese politics, electoral politics, and leadership. So there's a new book that was published last year by scholar Amy Katalinak called Dominance Through Division, Group-Based Clientelism in Japan. And this book really tries to understand the question, the puzzle of why in this democratic society, the Liberal Democratic Party just keeps winning elections over and over and over and over again. And Dr. Katalinak, Amy, has this answer relating to clientelism and electoral districts, and it's based on very, very thorough research. And then the second book is by a scholar historian who now works outside of academia named Tobias Harris, and he wrote this book that came out a few years ago, and it's a biography of Abe Shinzo called The Iconoclast. Looking at Abe and Abe's politics remains really important to understanding Japan, particularly under the new Takaichi government, where Takaichi got so much political mentoring from Mr. Abe. Tobias also has a really great Substack on contemporary Japanese politics called Japan Foresight, which looks at and I cheated and added a movie, if that's okay.
Yes, please. We love a variety of media on this show, so go for it.
My recent favorite movie to understand Japanese politics specifically is on Netflix, and it's called Bullet Train Explosion, Shinkansen Bakuhatsu. And it's this fabulous movie. There's bureaucratic politics, there's industrial politics, there's technology, there's action, there are bombs. It's really fun, and I think genuinely great for thinking about Japanese political organization.
Kyoko, have you seen Shinkansen Bakuhatsu? You're nodding there.
Yes, yes. I saw that. It was quite interesting and it's fun. Yes, it's enjoyable.
I shall try and find it then. Kristin, your point about the book Dominance Through Division, of course, LDP has won another huge election, an astonishing election victory in February. So very timely recommendations there.
This is what I think consistently people get the most wrong about Japan. This was perhaps true when I first started studying Japan many, many years ago, and is still true today. And that is using a concept of unchanging homogeneity, social conformity, to try and explain things that are very dynamic and really are changing. Japanese culture, which is the same everywhere in Japan and explains all of these things, which of course there's such great cultural diversity and all kinds of different heterogeneity within Japan that we need to really understand in order to try and understand this very dynamic and interesting place.
That's a fantastic point, actually. I don't think anyone's raised that. The sheer diversity within Japan, whether it's cuisine or whether it's accents. Obviously, Kyoko, you're in Niigata, very distinctive part of the world. I know Kyushu quite well. So again, so different. Again, thank you, Kristin. Kyoko, over to you, please.
I would recommend your book, Robert Ward, Evaluating Japan's New Grand Strategy, published in 2025, because this book offers a very concise but very comprehensive analysis of Japan's recent strategy. It covers defense, diplomacy, and also economic security and the structural limits on Japan's strategy. So it's very, very, very good if you want to understand Japan's strategy or foreign policy, whatever.
That's very generous of you, Kyoko. Thank you.
Yes.
And what do you think people get wrong about Japan?
Maybe because I live in Japan and I am a Japanese, it's very hard for me to find the point. If you live overseas or if you're a foreigner, you may tend to think, oh, this is wrong, and the people will misunderstand this point and that point. But because I live in Japan, I really don't see such mistakes. We have lots of information from social media and also internet. Perhaps lots of people now understand, even foreigners can now understand Japan correctly. I hope so.
Yes, a lot of that's due to the availability of movies and what have you from Japan, TV and manga and so on that are now much more widely available than they ever were. So yes, that's a good point. Well, thank you, Kristin and Kyoko, for a really fabulous discussion chat. Very rich and wonderful. Lots of details for us to go away and think about. Details of how to find Kristin and Kyoko on their social media channels of choice will be in the show notes, so do check them out. And they're both very widely published, some excellent analysis they've been writing, so do check that out as well. And as always, thank you to our listeners for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact us on japanchair@iiss.org. Japan Chair is all one word. And if you enjoyed this episode, we urge you to subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. And for more insightful analysis, please also look at past research from the Japan Chair program and from the IISS more broadly on our website. Thanks again, and see you next time.